And thanks to you guys. I appreciate you taking the time. And Tim, I'm gonna start off with you because I want you to sort of kick us off generally. You're involved in agencies throughout government providing oversight. What does it look like when an agency is doing well with data, when they're using it well? And give us some general best practices on that. And then if you have some sort of concrete examples of specific example, dive us into that as well.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. So thanks for having me. Thanks to GovExec. It's great to be here, especially with Michael and Veronica. So I'm going to say some things at the top, try not to take too much of the defense story's thunder, because I think there's some exciting things going on there that they'll tell you about. But at GAO, as Eric's saying, we do have this sort of pan-federal remit, and I'm getting to see the evolution of data science and usage into data analytics. I think it's useful, by the way, to think of things in the DIKW pyramid, meaning from the data layer up to information and adding value to knowledge and then to wisdom. And ultimately what we want to do is try and essentially the game, as it were, is to take and convert that data up the value chain and help our decision makers ultimately make better decisions, whether it's in a logistics context, whether it's in a spending context, whether it's in a staff management context, et cetera. And so I think there's some great things going on. Let me talk about a civilian case particularly. There's an undersecretary of Treasury who's leading a lot of work, so just several blocks from here, doing things in the fiscal service just to help essentially push out more and better data on USA spending. So if you're a good government entity, and in one sense I would assert that all of the leadership of the federal government is about good government, but even externally people can sit and look and pull data and yield and derive value on that. Just in the same way that I think it was exciting with the rise of 4G and 4G LTE technology that brought about the Ubers and the Lyfts and think the sort of sharing economy in that regard. I think data can be the engine that helps transform. So I see this, I know the title of the conference was more in terms of a rising to the challenges. I think it's also a seizing the opportunities and the challenges that are being brought about by data. I personally think that we're entering a renaissance for management and leadership to be able to use this. I think it requires a cultural change in thinking, our different workforce strategy. I think culture is the main frictional point on this, but I think we can seize that and do that. There are certainly challenges. Data are not often easy. We have often lots of it, but it's not in the right form. So I don't want to soft pedal the idea that there are indeed challenges, that's for sure. But I think the opportunities and the ROI on this particular activity strategically is incredible. And I think it's even as low hanging fruit type tasks like for robotic process automation, all the way up to more machine learning augmented intelligence, not really artificial or replacement of humans, which I think is the wrong narrative. So I've done a lot of strategic work on AI and data analytics innovation and so on, and this is where this is coming from. But let me give you an example for DLA. So one of the defense agencies, Defense Logistics Agency, we've done some work on with them for many years. And of course, they're a supply chain management function for defense. And it wasn't until 2016, at that inflection point, there was a time where 2016 DLA had, or the defense industrial base or supply chain had 1.4 million SKUs. It wasn't until that point in 2016 when Walmart.com actually exceeded them. So there was a time when DLA had more SKUs, as it were, in an apples-to-apples sense than Walmart.com had. Right now, it's been exceeded, and Amazon has even more, et cetera. But I'm just trying to paint the picture of you're trying to manage an enterprise like that with weapon systems that have to live on decadal timescales. And the supply chain management practice demands data to help drive decisions and manage risk and things. And there are great risks in our industrial base. I need not go further with this particular crowd, I'm sure you know. But I think so. What's happening, though, is starting with low-hanging fruit. They have an RPA lead at DLA doing some exciting things, and they're moving from tens to hundreds of RPAs. And if you can do that just for a relative to the entire DoD universe, if DLA is small, think about the incredible amount of things that are going on, some of it I'm sure Michael and Veronica will mention. So we also do work on readiness and so on. I'm not going to steal any of Veronica's thunder, but there's a huge amount of opportunity to readiness. There's a huge amount in terms of avoiding non-McCurdy breaches in our major weapon systems, right? Again, in the DoD context. So again, I think the future is good if we but seize it and if we think about it the right way and change the culture into a data-fied, a algorithmic thinking like culture.
Well, that's great, and that's a good segue into exactly what I wanted to ask you about, Assistant Secretary Daigle. When I was thinking about this, one thing that came to mind, because we've been hearing about it for a while, is the Defense Readiness Reporting System. And I know you're sort of spearheading a reform of that. How is that effort going to lead to an improved use of data at the department?
Well, hopefully it does.
Well, I guess we'll see.
Thank you again, and thank you to GovExec and to Defense One. It's great to be here. As you said, my office, which is the Office of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness, oversees the Defense Readiness Reporting System. This system dates back to, I think it was initiated in about 1999, so it really dates back to the early 2000s, when it was actually implemented. And if you think about how many things have changed since the early 2000s, it kind of gives you an idea. The system has, evolved, but we recognize that it needs to evolve a lot more. For me, this is actually a pretty exciting position to be in. My background when I started in government was at the Office of Management and Budget. I was a budget examiner, oversaw one of the service accounts, and readiness was critical because it was the operation and maintenance account. And so I was always trying to tie resources to outcomes, readiness outcomes. And how do I know that the dollars that we're putting into, let's say, an op-tempo account, how does that result in an outcome? And how do I measure the value of that dollar? And I would try to use some of the data coming out of the readiness reporting system to draw correlations, and found that it didn't always seem to align. And then I moved over to the department's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Group, which is known as CAPE back then. Well, I guess it had just changed to CAPE. Prior to that, it was PA&E. But continued to work on readiness issues. And so recognized that there was work that needed to be done on DERS and thought that it needed to evolve. So it's very exciting. Sometimes it's, be careful what you wish for. So now I'm in the office that actually oversees the policy for DERS. And so, hearkening to your question, we see that there are some great opportunities here. And actually, with the passage of the National Defense Strategy, we actually take that as a guidepost. That really helped to establish a framework for how we would look at changes to DERS, because the NDS established ready for what. And the question really is, okay, if you think about that, how do I use the information that's in DERS to help me figure out what capabilities do we have, what forces do we have ready, how quickly are they ready, but also forecasting out. DERS is very good at giving you a current snapshot, but it really wasn't designed with that idea of predictive analysis. And that is definitely something that we know we need to do. And that's also important just for planning purposes, as we look forward. What is it? What are the forces that we're going to need? How ready do we need them to be? And then when we're planning our budgets and our programs going forward, how do we ensure that we're targeting resources to the right place? So that's really the effort that we have underway. And I have to give a shout out to Congress. I have to thank them for legislation that they passed in the 2019 NDAA, which actually directed the department to consolidate our readiness reporting systems. What may not be known is that we have what's called DERS Strategic, which is the enterprise-wide system, and that's the one that my office maintains. We fund it and we operate it. But 3 of the services actually have their own systems, their own reporting systems that feed into that DERS Strategic. And so the legislation mandated us to consolidate all of that into one system. And it's very exciting to do it. It's exciting if you're me, But it's exciting because it gives us an opportunity to streamline the reporting. It gives us an opportunity to get access to authoritative data sources, so you have direct feeds into the strategic system, which hopefully and this is something that Michael Conlin and I have talked a lot about, ultimately I would like to make the user interface easier for those who have to actually input the information. My goal would be to, in this day and age, a lot of this information should be automatically calculated. We should be able to leverage data to get to a lot of our ratings. We shouldn't be relying on a lot of user input here. The user input's important because you definitely want to know what those out in the field believe and how they're interpreting the information. So some things you just can't get from data. So I think that's another important thing for us to keep in mind as we're looking at the system, is that data's important, but it's not everything. Sometimes you need the insights that come from those on the ground, and so we want to make sure that we keep that in the system. But those are really some of the main things we're going after. I think also we know that the underlying architecture has got to be improved. We want to be able to leverage analytic tools that are out there, and right now there is a fair amount of kind of making it work that we have to do. So we want to upgrade the system so that we can do that.
Great. Michael, as the Pentagon is sort of undertaking a lot of the efforts that the Assistant Secretary just laid out for us, and she touched on this to some extent, but how much is this about discovering new data that we haven't had access to ever before versus sort of harnessing data that's been out there forever and we haven't really figured out how to use it until now? Is this about new tech like Tim was talking about with machine learning and AI, or is this about a cultural change within the department, or is it sort of a combination?
It really is a combination of those things. Like Tim, I would always start from a cultural perspective. There are a number of things about our culture that do not lend themselves to more modern practices. And to put that in context, I'm a commercial sector guy. Before this job, I never worked in government. I had no prior direct exposure. And I was hired to bring commercial sector best practices into the department in this particular domain. The challenge becomes people want to talk about technology and really cool tools, and there are wonderful tools, and I'm a guy that writes Python code and trains machine learning algorithms and wrangles data, so I like the tools. But if we don't start from a cultural change, we're not going to get where we need to go. The Department of Defense does not have a culture of data-centered decision-making. We have a culture of rules-centric decision-making. What's the Uniform Code of Military Justice? What are the rules of engagement, et cetera? And experience-centric decision-making. The problem with experience-centric decision-making is that all experience is local. It's isolated. And the department is large and scattered and with a complex organization, and so all of those experiences are different from one another. And they don't bring a department-wide perspective. Our challenge jointly with DERS and Readiness reporting, my challenge broadly is to enable decisions on a department-wide basis. Our secretary, our deputy secretary, all of the direct reports to those individuals want to make decisions that optimize the ecosystem of the Department of Defense. There's no sense in optimizing the Air Force and neglecting the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the back office, logistics functions, et cetera. When you optimize individual components of an ecosystem, by definition, you will break the ecosystem. So we're now trying to make department-wide decisions to optimize the performance. And after all, when we compete against an adversary, we compete on a department-wide basis. Right? This is everybody's in. So we've got to get to a department-wide perspective on the data. And the DERS experience, and I've had the privilege of working with Ms. Daigle, has been enormously emblematic of this larger challenge of a culture. Everybody looks at this through their own lens rather than seeing it from the perspective of the secretary. And as we've worked with those decision makers, it's been really interesting because we only have to bring their view up to this level of what's the best thing for the department. But we have to grapple with two things. The systems we have are meant to tell us what happened some months back. Not why it happened, just what. And we need to know why as well, because once we know that, we can predict what will happen with some degree of confidence, and we can put a number on that. And that's important because the Evidence Act requires me to do that, put a confidence number on these kinds of things. But we want to know what will happen. So if we have another $1 million, where do we put that $1 million to get the best outcomes? We also want to be able to say, what do we want to make happen, and how are we going to tune the system? And that's different data at each stage, and that's different mechanics at each stage. But if you don't get the basics right, you're stuffed. If the quality of your data is poor, you're stuffed, especially if it's incomplete. And part of our challenge has been there are still human beings tapping on keyboards to put data into systems instead of having it being generated automatically in the field through sensors and et cetera, sensors and scanners and platforms. And that's really what you want to be doing. When we look at Uber, and we look at Lyft, and we look at the Airbnb, and we look at these organizations that are changing the world, they're fundamentally world-class data organizations. And part of our challenge is to get to be a world-class data organization, not only because we owe it to the taxpayer, not only because the President's management agenda calls for it, not only because the President's executive order on American leadership in AI calls for it, but because we're the Department of Defense. So we need to take a leading position on this because the nation is depending on us.
Right.
Tim, you're aggressively nodding your head.
Yeah, I just wanted to second, it really amplifies something, pulling out what Michael's really saying. Really, you're talking about shifting from this compliance-like mentality into a risk management one.
Oh, yeah.
And I would say, my dad was Navy, I was into DoD culture. We don't win wars on just compliance alone.
No.
Right? We do need to care about UCMJ, all those things. Mm-hmm. But that's necessary, but not sufficient. How do we do that? That's how things happen out in the field, and it has to be that, and data is going to be the fuel to help drive that. You asked about best practices. Let me be really salient with 3. If I could, I'd be like the most important things in real estate is location, location, location. But this one would be leadership. Number 1 for sure, by far, leadership. Leaders like Veronica or others, secretarial level, saying we needs do this and drive that. I think leadership is the preeminent thing which can help drive that culture change. The tone at the top and so on is critical. The second thing is realizing that you have more than what you may know. So it is, as Michael's saying, there's a lot of data wrangling. There's a non-trivial cost. There will be pain and suffering and friction in wrangling data in certain things. It's not this sunshine path of roses, but if you can overcome, or you start to shepherd or steer the data, as Michael's talking about, you have sensors automatically, you demand the format it comes in, it becomes now more of that refined oil, as it were, coming into the system to yield better decisions. And third, you have a project or pilot, start small, but you have a sandbox pilot mentality type thing where you have a high tolerance of failure to try some things out. So it's important not to just come in and overpromise and underdeliver as like a CDO or a data person saying, I'm a quantum and come in to do your job. Like Veronica's saying, it's really about supporting the human element. It's not about replacing the human element. So understanding those pain points, pulling out the problems, starting with problem definition and forging that into projects and things, maybe low-hanging fruit to start, but build that momentum is the way to go. Don't just write a large check, and don't do what Michael's saying as well, which is don't start with the technology. What are we trying to do? What are the key things? And pain points come in usually a mixture of complaining and then some real problem that you can pull out and attack that. So those are the 3 key things that I would say to do in this area, best practice area.
I'm going to quick foot stomp something you said. So for those of you that read a lot of the press about machine learning and artificial intelligence and think that that's going to replace people, let me explain something to you from the inside. AI will not replace people where you work. People who use AI where you work will replace people who do not use AI where you work. We're making the performance of people better with machine learning and AI. And it will be a very, very long time before AI replaces human beings, roughly approaching the heat death of the universe. And again, I say this as a technologist who really likes this stuff, but it is incredibly not ready for prime time in many, many instances, and all of the applications that deliver value are tightly focused, narrow applications of AI. There ain't no such thing as general purpose AI. Don't let people mislead you on that.
And if I could just
go
real
ahead.
quick.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
We've bought ourselves a few years now, so you have some time to.
No, I was just going to say, just touching on that, I think I alluded to this, but one of the most valuable pieces within the DERS system right now is actually the comments section. And that's the section where you have your commanders on the ground who are actually they'll type it. It's an explanatory section, for why the ratings are the way they are. But we have found, just in doing analysis, that going through and finding keywords, right, or just trying to find, trends that we're seeing in different communities, that gives you a lot of insight into the areas that we are perhaps not tracking right now. And so we have found tremendous value just through that. And I think being able to leverage machine learning so that we could draw some of that out, because sometimes there's a move to say, well, maybe we don't need to collect those comments anymore. Maybe
Oh, no,
we can
we do.
just,
We need
right,
them.
but maybe we can just use data. And yet there are tools out there where you can use those comments and you can actually draw trends and pull analysis from that. So I think there's, it's very exciting, the technologies that are available out there. But again, we just need to make sure that the system supports that kind of technology.
And that reminds me, I've been meaning to tell you, we brought in a natural language processing expert. We're going to stick him on the comment
That's
section.
good news.
Yeah.
That's good.
Assistant Secretary, I'm going to kick it right back to you because you just touched on an area where you see room for growth. What is Defense still not doing with data that you'd like to see? I mean, certain things come to mind. GAO and others have pointed out a lack of data supporting staffing decisions at the Pentagon occasionally, or auditability failures. What lessons are we learning from that?
So I can speak to my
Sure.
foxhole, or the area where I am. So I would say, so I definitely put a large value on data. So I know that when we are generating reports or information, there's always the section, okay, where do we have the data to support this? So there are some, some findings that we have for which, it's based sometimes on experience. And so, I think trying to track down data to support all of the findings that we're having, that it's always a challenge. But I would say, for me, one of the challenges we have a lot of data. There actually is a lot of data in the department. And for me, it is sometimes trying to figure out what is the most meaningful data that I should be looking at to answer a particular question, so that I'm not, sometimes you can get caught where you're focused on a particular set of data, and so that is informing your decisions, but you're losing sight of maybe the bigger picture or other information that may be out there. So, and this probably touches on what Michael is saying, which is, I think it's getting that wider view. That's where I think we can do a lot better. We tend to have data sometimes in silos, and kind of breaking down those walls so that we're sharing data more and having data systems talk to each other. That is an amazing challenge. So you have systems that were created, different years ago. They're on different they're on different platforms. They use different code. Now, sometimes the base is the fields where you would link. You think it might be easy, if you want to, on an identification code, let's say for a unit or something. It's not always going to be in the same format.
Typically not be.
Right. So, if I want to try to draw relationships, can't do it. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, just getting all our systems to talk to each other.
In fact, it's quite easy, I think, to focus on the sheer volume of data and forget the variety issue. Yes. So let me put a point on the variety issue for you. We recently released our digital modernization strategy, and in it, our CIO describes the fact that we have roughly 10,000 operational systems in the Department of Defense. Every one of those systems was put in place by a different team of people meeting a different set of requirements with a different budget for different customers in a different place at a different time, over a time scale of 60 years of IT. It's like working in an archaeological dig. We got, you name it, we got it. And I would challenge you to find 2 instances of the same data schema across those 10,000 operational systems. The data schemas are naturally different. And as somebody used to write code for a living, this does not surprise me at all, because it's not just us, it's many large organizations. But that variety is an enormous challenge. And so Veronica wants to ask a question to get a simple answer about how many of these. Well, unfortunately, I have to take data from here and here and here and here and here and map them to a common schema just so I can add them up. Because they named the fields differently, they formatted the fields differently, they formatted the records differently. It's wild variety. Now, if it wasn't like that, they might not need me, they might need somebody else, so I guess I should be happy about that. But getting to the point where, without changing that installed base, because I don't directly control those budgets, I still need to deliver meaningful common data to decision makers like Veronica. That is an enormous amount of effort. Someday we want to clean up the back, right? Back office got to clean it up. That's outside my remit. I still have to deliver value today because I have executives who need meaningful insights.
And GAO's backing you big time, because you all know this is a high-risk issue from GAO's perspective, the readiness issue. I was talking with Veronica before. She was like, do you know John Pendleton? He's our defense issue. He does readiness. We need this to win. We need Michael to win, feeding up into Veronica in this. We're not where we need to be in the defense issues. This is so critical, and I think it's underappreciated in terms of the magnitude and the challenge or the crisis that this particular problem is. I worry it's a law of conservation of energy of the department on. You might pursue large weapon system type things over here, and that may take away from the idea about energy put into readiness, which is at a crisis point. Just look at the Navy story, what's been going on there.
I would say, just there is a tremendous focus on readiness right now. So I do feel that we have a lot of backing. I think this is. It's a great time to be doing this right now, because I do believe we have the leadership focus. We certainly have the appetite, the hunger for the information and for data. I did want to touch on one issue, though, that I did not, and teed it up perfectly for me, and I didn't hit it. But linking budget data and resource data to readiness data, that is a windmill that I've been tilting at for years. And so that is an area where if I could make improvement on something, it would be there. It would be the way that we budget resources, by SAGs or budget line items or however, being able to draw relationships between that and the way that we measure readiness outcomes. Those communities don't always talk. So, and that's limiting. So what you want to, because you want to make sure that, as you're accounting for resources, that you know how it links to the outcomes. We can do it in some areas, so I'm not saying this is a broad issue, but I think there's a lot of work that can be done there.
I'd like to just foot stomp that. Our programming, planning, budgeting, and execution setup was designed by Robert McNamara when he was the Secretary of Defense. That was a different time.
Yeah.
We had different needs, we had a different scale, and for heaven's sake, a more streamlined approach to that would benefit everybody, including the taxpayer, but most importantly, the warfighter.
That breaks the adage of we're fighting the last war. That's like the last war, something like that. So, right. Yeah.
Michael, as you and your team go about identifying specific data projects that you want to undertake, what's that process like? How do you pick those out? And I think we've heard from everybody pretty much here about the importance of getting buy-in from the leadership. Is that ever a difficult process? If you're dealing with specific managers or even frontline people that maybe hasn't been a part of their job purview in the past.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah. So I mean,
let's talk about the process, right?
Sure.
The process, if you want to be successful, the process always starts with an executive who is trying to transform performance, affordability, some element of the organization. It's either the activity level, the outputs, the outcomes especially. But if you don't have an executive that's trying to improve things, you keep looking till you find an executive. And then you ask, well, what are the goals for improvement? Are we going to measure those? And what data do you need to know where we are and how rapidly we're changing. Because as an executive, you're trying to make decisions, and you can't do that in the absence of data. And you identify all those clear, critical business questions, and you document those because you're trying to answer those. And you need to be quite tightly focused on not every question you could ever answer, but on the ones needed to improve the organization. Then you go look for the authoritative sources, and you look for the owners of those authoritative sources, and you come face to face with those 10,000 operational systems, so you get a subset of those. And you build a structure that lets you answer those questions, mapping to each of those authoritative sources. That means you're going to transform data. That means you need the owners to confirm you didn't transform it in the wrong way, you got it in the right way, so that it still represents their operations. And then you start doing the analysis on the data. What does it tell us? You apply all the basic statistics, all of the descriptive statistics. You try to understand then regression lines and things like that, and how's the best way to visualize this data. And then you might apply inferential statistics, and now you're getting into machine learning. But you're fundamentally trying to understand what happened, and then certainly why did it happen in a mathematically provable way. If it's not mathematically provable, it doesn't count, right? Accuracy, validity, recall, precision, these are statistically provable things, confidence levels, comfort factors. If you haven't done the math, you don't know the data. And I cannot stand in front of a decision maker like Veronica or any of her peers without mathematical proof. That would be unprofessional in my view, but it's also outside the requirements of the Evidence Act, by the way, and the guidance we get in support of the Evidence Act. So that's the life cycle, right? You start from an executive who's trying to make an improvement, and you work your way to data that enables them to manage that improvement in an active way, in a sustained way over time. Now, throughout that, you're going to run into people who have data that's their own unique thing in their own unique way, and they don't want to change that. Or you're going to come up with an opportunity to improve things, and it's going to be outside of an individual's incentive plan. They're not measured on this level of activity, and data is typically one that's not measured. What's the quality of your data, the completeness of your data, right? We confront this a lot. And if you are running a repair depot, you might be measured in terms of planes out the door every day rather than the quality of your data. But you can't manage what you don't measure, and if you're not capturing the data, you can't sustain any rate of output. But if the performance measure is planes out the door, by golly, they will get planes out the door. They will do nothing other than get planes out the door, especially not capture data. Right. And so now you're stuck, right? If you don't reach several levels up and change the performance measures, and this gets back to culture. How do I change the definition of someone's performance, meets and exceeds, and create incentives for them to capture that data so that we can, for example, track a part across its life cycle or a plane across its life cycle and know whether it, so sometimes you find a bad actor part you want to get out of your supply chain. Well, if you're not tracking that individual part every time you touch it, you can't spot that. So you need the data, but somebody has to capture it. And a wrench turner may not want to capture the data if they're incented on getting planes out the door. So we have a few challenges, and that all this management of change stuff is the bigger challenge, because you get right back to Tim's point of culture.
So is that something that you've been advocating, trying to change the way that, making that more a part of performance measurement?
Yes, and it goes back to the executive that we started with, and their agenda for improving that performance. If you've chosen the right executive, if you've stumbled across the right executive, then they're able to then take those next actions or persuade those next actions to be taken. And you get it rippling through the system.
Right, but so there is occasionally some a resistance that it has to be overcome.
There's always resistance. I mean, seriously, I've been doing this stuff for a long time. There's always resistance. You have to expect resistance. And it's not because they're bad people. It's not because they're dumb people or uneducated. These are really smart, talented people. Let me tell you something. I have been impressed, incredibly impressed with the quality of people in the Department of Defense. Whether they are a wrench turner or whether they are a med tech or whether they are an infantryman or whether that's a pilot or whether it's somebody in a civilian role, and whether it's somebody that's an assistant secretary. Extraordinary high quality people, dedicated people, smart people. They do what they are told to do, and that's where the rub comes in. So there are always difficulties, but I've never found an organization that didn't have that. So we just come at it knowing we're going to get it. We just have to cope with it.
Tim, I wanted to ask you how, in your own work at GAO, how is your agency itself using data as you sort of manage your own workload? You know, the government's a pretty big place, and you guys have a lot of work to do in overseeing it. So how does data help you figure out, you know, what investigations and audits to launch, or how to focus your work once you're sort of involved in the project?
Sure, it's a great question. So, right, we, in one sense, GAO has been a data analysis organization for decades. I think the issue now is the agility, the speed, the opportunity the technologies bring, the size and scale of the data, the convergent technologies like cloud and wireless, all those things that are really enabling and empowering, and what makes it exciting for like the Michaels in DoD, but also as CDOs continue to proliferate, like looking at the CFO Act and the drive for that. We would be a blessed nation if we have CDOs like Michael in every department and agency doing and solving these sort of problems, because there's tremendous things. We have issues, as my teenage daughter would say. Yes. But so GAO, in our role, we want to, of course, apply good oversight to support Congress in that regard, but we also want to be a model agency in usage of data. And so it's an exciting time for us because we have stood up a innovation lab. It was called the Audit Innovation Lab, but because GAO just doesn't do audits only, we do a wide array of professional services for the Congress. We were just saying, look, we just want to call it Innovation Lab. We actually want to apply a DARPA-like innovation philosophy, which is about meritorious ideas coming in and changing the world, right? Oftentimes from these wrench turners, like Michael's saying, incredible bright people, not only in defense, but across the workforce that can often know their mission. And if they express it in a way that says, you know, we could do this a little bit better, maybe even exponentially better, using data and the tools as an engine to do that, there's huge opportunity. So for us, it's setting aside this sandbox space, applying on this the real world, the messy data, all the things Michael was describing on things. It's a lot of work, but having that, and then I'm excited because we have now I just hired our first chief data scientist, who's going to be working across GAO and its enterprise and trying to attack some of the big gnarly problems that we're facing. Veronica mentioned her time at OMB, for example. So we are partnering with the deputy CFO at OMB just because there's $1.4 trillion as an estimate of improper payments over a decade. That's trillion with a T, ladies and gentlemen. Wow. Okay, so there's absolutely no controversy politically about trying to save that kind of money in case it's the fraud, waste, and abuse wedge of that, but there's also the foolish or the stupid double payments, that kind of thing that we often do, and it becomes a pay and chase thing for our inspectors general and so on, and other issues. So trying to save on that, trying to bring transparency to what's going on, building those management dashboards so you could actually do that enterprise risk management. So we're starting small, but we're going entirely cutting out and abandoning any of the past systems in terms of trying to wrestle with 1980s like architectures, because we're not being operational in that sense. We're just carving out a space to say, this is a true lab. What if we looked at the idea in a different way, using data and state-of-the-art tools and the convergent technologies and creative people based on a rigorous problem definition and then running it through. And so we, hopefully, if we're successful, it's about culture change, as Michael's talking about, within GAO to try and better help GAO ultimately of the future convert questions to answers in the interest of Congress. So there's a huge, massive swirl. For those of you who are in DC, you know there's a big appetite on the Hill, I think in the executive branch as well, as you're hearing in Veronica's story, really for evidence-based policy making. And really that's just fueled by, again, data and analytics running up through, whether it's a machine learning or whether, but there's always some amount of that human in the loop, and again, that goes back to the change. So we want to be part of the change by doing that and saying, well, let's compare this with what we're doing. How's it done now? Let's compare what we could do over here. Invite the creative ideas, regardless of your rank in the hierarchy, and run on those ideas about what might have the most impact and pursue that. That's the DARPA success story, because you can't look at a service now or a weapon system and things that has not been touched in some way by that. And I love the story of the stealth program. The U.S. stealth program was occurred years ago or decades ago because a person walked into the DARPA office with a Russian science paper on the diffusion of electromagnetic emanations and said, what if we could make U.S. aircraft disappear from radar, enemy radar? And that was like, you know, are you watching too much Star Trek? It was weird and wacky. It was like, get out of my office kind of stuff. But the space that created and said, how might we do this entirely differently? What if we could change the game? And creating that nurturing environment to do that in a permissionless sort of way, but yet still mission relevant way is what we want to do.
Well, that's a good place to end it, I think. Inspirational note there. Everybody come up with the next stealth program. And so thank you to the panelists for being here. I think that was a really great discussion, and thanks to everyone for listening to us.
Thanks a lot.